Welcome back to the Red Dice Diaries, and in this RPG review I'm going to be reviewing Mindjammer, the role-playing game written by Sarah Newton of Modiphius Games, and it's an approximately 500-page hardback book that uses the Fate core system as its main rules. And I came to be reviewing this because I saw the author discussing it some time ago, just prior to publication and following publication, on one of the Google Plus Fate communities that I belong to. However, it's taken me a little while to get round to reviewing this game of transhuman sci-fi, although it does cover other sci-fi genres, as we'll see later on. Now, why has it taken me so long to get round to reviewing it? Well, to be perfectly honest, it's a very large book, as you can see there. I'm quite a fan of the sort of smaller digest books, but let it not be said that I'm a stranger to the allure of a big, hefty, weighty tome. As long as the extra pages aren't simply filler and they're full of useful things, which I hope, as this review will show, this book is. I mean, I'm not saying that this book is huge. However, if Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet had had this book at the end of that very famous film, then not only would there have been room enough for the two of them on it, but they could have probably saved the band as well. This really is a seriously weighty tome. So, the game uses the Fate core central mechanic. Effectively, characters are made up of aspects, skills and stunts. Aspects are little story tags that justify certain in-game bonuses. Skills are rated by an adjective and a number, and stunts allow you to either gain bonuses under specific circumstances or to tweak or bend the rule, or even break occasionally, the rules under certain circumstances. When you come to make a skill test, you roll 4 fate dice. Each of them has 2 sides that are plain, 2 sides with a plus on it, 2 sides with a minus on it. You total up the number. So for instance, if I roll 2 pluses and a minus, my overall dice modifier is a 0. You then add this to your skill level, and if it's an opposed roll, you're looking to beat your opponent's final roll result. If it's an unopposed roll, you're looking to beat a difficulty rating set by your GM. And I've done a number of videos that cover a more detailed description of the Fate system, so to save going into it in more detail here, I'll put a link to those down below. So, without further ado, let's crack on with looking at the contents of Mindjammer. Chapter 1 is the introduction, and it's a basic intro to what the book contains, and a capsule description of the book's default setting, the new commonality of mankind. A previously collapsing stellar empire that has now, following the invention of faster-than-light travel through what they call two-space centuries ago, entered a period of expansion and is seeking to re-establish contact with and reclaim its lost colonies. We move straight on to Chapter 2, which covers the basics, and Mindjammer wastes no time in getting to grips with the Fate rules and manages to cover all the basic things you'd expect to see in a Fate book, making a test, using aspects, etc. And it's done in a very concise, very well written chapter. Very efficiently covered. There's not a lot of excess unwarranted stuff in this chapter. The rules are explained in a very clear and concise manner, which I quite liked. In the unlikely event you did have to reference the rules much in play, I think having them pretty much all covered in this one neat capsule chapter would make it very easy to find and reduce book flipping during a session, which is always a good thing in my opinion. Chapter 3 is all about creating characters, and it goes into the detail that you'd expect from a Fate product, advises the prospective GM to consider matters of game scope and the main issues or plots of the game at this early stage, encouraging the GM to involve the players with these decisions so everyone ends up with a game they enjoy. I've said it before with other Fate products, but this is still one of the main things that attracts me to the game, the emphasis on a collaborative experience. There are also useful little shaded box outs during the chapter and throughout the whole of the book that focus on specific parts of character creation and other processes in more detail, seeking to address common problems or potential issues. They also offer some great advice for GMs, whether it be on how to create more or less experienced characters, or the effect changing certain aspects of the character or campaign generation could have on your game. And I think these box outs are certainly worth looking at. It's nice to see everything drilled down to in a little bit more detail, and alternatives offered should you want them. There's a slight unfortunate tendency to mention some concepts in the book before they have been described. For example, the halo being mentioned early on, but not actually being described in any real detail until page 186. However, all these examples are page reference, so it's really only a minor niggle and doesn't take much for you to actually look at the page and go, oh, that's what the halo is, and then flick back and carry on. Chapter 4 is titled Cultures, Genotypes and Occupations. It takes an interesting approach to cultures, genotypes and occupations. Some of Mindjammer's aspects are based on these concepts, and the write-ups provide some options to inform character decisions further down the line. The game says that characters can step outside this, providing a discussion with the GM has been had, but the write-ups provide you with the most common options available for choosing your aspects. Now, I know some people have said that it can often be a bewildering choice when you're confronted with the panoply of options that fate throws open to you. So it's nice to actually see some concrete examples to get people going. But the game does always bear in mind that if you come up with a great character idea that maybe doesn't fit this mould 100%, talk with your GM about it, work it out between yourself and the rest of the group, and just go with it. And I really like that whole approach that seems to permeate the whole book. For example, the commonality culture, the culture that unites many humans within the society of the commonality, and is effectively the norm for characters in the 21st century, suggests the following. Cultural aspects: humanity is transcending, a light for the many worlds of space. For genotypes, it suggests commonality human, xenomorph, synthetic or hominid. Demeanour, it suggests conservative, controlled or diverse, yet alert for divergence. For language, it suggests universal. Tech index is T9, which is the second age of space, the sort of default futuristic tech level of the setting. Occupations, it suggests culture agent, sci-tech or spacer, clearly placing the emphasis on exploration and preserving and discovering other cultures. Equipment, it suggests advanced, discrete, mindscape implant, which we'll talk a bit more about later, and various enhancements, which are sort of cybernetic style extras that you can purchase for your character. Genotypes represent your species, body type, etc., and they may include mandatory point spends, aspects and extras that you have to buy out of your character creation budget. It also provides suggestions for occupations and other such things, from commonality humans to the uplifted animals of the xenomorph genotype. Now, I like the balance that Mindjammer has struck between mandatory purchases and still allowing some leeway and wiggle room for the players to be creative with their choices. And there's also a nice advice on creating your own genotypes and other game elements. Occupations likewise provide suggestions for character building and also provide permission to take otherwise forbidden extras. For example, being a merchant gives you permission to take starship and organisation extras, representing organisational ties and your own form of transport. Also worthy of mention in this chapter is the tech index, representing what level of tech a character is comfortable with using, and providing a penalty based on the difference between the tech level of a piece of equipment and of the character. It's an interesting idea, and given the potential differing levels of tech that can occur in sci-fi, it's a wise inclusion. I'm not entirely sure that such a numerical solution was necessary though. Personally, I would just say that if a character's tech level differed a lot from the tech they were using and they suffered from an aspect called uncomfortable with the tech or something similar that could be compelled by the GM, That's a minor niggle though, and the system is perfectly workable and sound from a systemic point of view. Chapter 5 is called Aspects and Fate Points, and it gives some very clearly written advice on how to create aspects that will make the most of the fate system and how to use them within the game. Sometimes in fate games it can be a little confusing when exactly an aspect can be invoked or compelled. Mindjammer does a great job of providing suggestions for the various aspects that it offers. Chapter 6 is called Skills and Stunts, and it explains skills and stunts, providing guidelines on how to create your own stunts. And this will be familiar to anyone who knows the fate system, but essentially stunts allow you to add a new action to a skill. For example, having a backstab stunt that allows you to attack with a sneak skill rather than a combat skill. Add a bonus to an action under a specific circumstance, for instance gaining +2 to pilot when in the cockpit of a shuttle, or create a single rules exception. For example, a riposte stunt that allows you to inflict a 2 stress hit on an opponent when you successfully defend with style, rather than gaining a boost as per the normal rules. And the rest of the chapter is taken up by skill descriptions and lists of sample stunts that are linked to the various skills. And these are all well written and give the reader a good idea of what exactly can be achieved with the versatility of stunts within the fate system. Of main interest to me in the chapter is the section titled Skills and the Mindscape, with many citizens of the commonality having implanted chips that link them into the vast interstellar mindscape network, allowing them to perform mental scans and utilise programmed skills chips to acquire knowledge and skills that they otherwise wouldn't possess. It's an idea that's been used in a few science fiction futuristic settings, and so it's interesting to see it make an appearance here, although sadly not much detail is given in this chapter about skill chips beyond the fact that they exist, although that is covered in more detail later in the book. Chapter 7 is called Extras, and extras are additional extensions to your character, covering everything from additional capabilities granted by the Mindscape implant to the extraordinary abilities of synthetics and xenomorphs. Extras are represented as packages of skills, aspects and stunts that combine to create very specific game effects. This is a nice approach since it maintains the versatility, but at a cost of slightly more bookkeeping, although to be honest it's not a great deal more. There's some interesting ideas on organisational extras, where your character may be a member of an organisation but may not be in sole control of it. And there's a smattering of sample extras littered throughout the chapter. Some are better and more interesting than others, but they're all workable within the system and they're all neatly written. Chapter 8 is called Technology, and the chapter starts off defining the technology paradigm of the commonality, the default setting of the game. Most items in the commonality have some level of inbuilt intelligence, but computers and calculating machines, as we know them, are little more than historical curiosities by this time. It's common in the default setting for intelligence to be boosted artificially, whether that be via technology or mindscape implant, or even to be entirely independent of a human brain, perhaps existing entirely in the virtuality of the mindscape or in some other artificial form. The chapter discusses common technology in the setting, such as infinite storage capacity, variform design, which is equipment that reshapes itself to the requirements of the user, and 0-point power, which is a form of energy derived from extra-dimensional space. All of it is very interesting, and it provides enough pseudoscience to seem on some level convincing without bogging the game down in complexity. After all, to my mind, since it is science fiction, it needs the edge of science, but it also needs to be balanced by the fiction. After all, I'm not sitting down to play a scientific thesis, I'm actually looking to play a game that I enjoy. And to me, Mindjammer has the balance just right. Gives just enough to seem convincing, but not too much that it'll boggle the mind of anyone who doesn't have a science degree. Tech indexes are discussed again in slightly more detail, along with enhancements, which are technological modifications that you can add to your character. A large equipment and enhancement list follows, which is fairly comprehensive, and should provide all the weapons, armour, cyber tech, whatever that you could want. I do love the fact that it's kept fairly general. An energy weapon is simply a blaster pistol on the equipment list. Unlike some other science fiction games that seem to use ever so slightly varying weapon designs as filler for books to pad out their supplements. I think Mindjammer should be applauded for not doing this. After all, most GMs are perfectly capable of tweaking weaponry to create variants themselves without needing a book to do it for them. So I applaud the general usage of the equipment list, and I certainly think there's a lot of mileage in it for numerous sci-fi sub-genres. The graphics scattered throughout the chapter are nice and clearly drawn, and it's fairly easy to see where the inspiration for some of the bits of kit actually came from, which is no bad thing. It's nice to know where the artists got their inspiration from. And a small number of basic vehicles and starships are also covered. Chapter 9 is called Playing the Game, and it's a fairly standard Fate rules chapter with nothing that will surprise anyone who's read any other Fate books. But again, there's nice box outs exploring certain elements of the system in further detail. It's all nicely written and certainly stands up against any other Fate book that I've read. Chapter 10 is called GMing Mindjammer, and as with most books, it's normally the GMing chapter that I place under most scrutiny. And this one starts off in a fairly standard way with a few paragraphs explaining what the GM's job is. This is well written, but nothing particularly unexpected or new. As with many Fate games, the emphasis here is placed squarely on the game being a collaborative effort, and this is something I wholeheartedly support, and is covered in detail in the Let the Players Help box out. And I think that phrase, let the players help, should be a mantra for many GMs out there, beleaguered GMs who take the whole weight of the game on their shoulder. I know I've done it myself, and I know I sometimes forget this myself, but the players really can help by shouldering some of that burden of game design for you. The GMing chapter is well written and presents the various elements of the game in a logical and uncluttered fashion, including writing on such subjects as when and not to roll the dice and creating NPCs, amongst others. For me, the most enjoyable parts of this chapter were the discussion on making failure awesome and succeeding at a cost. I've seen a lot of games where players have become discouraged because their otherwise competent characters have failed abysmally at a routine or otherwise a task they expect to be able to succeed at, entirely because they've got a really poor dice roll. And the game suggests making a failure like this a result of unexpected circumstances or complications rather than character ineptitude, which I think is a great idea, and it also offers some clear examples of ways to bring in complications when the player succeeds at a cost. I think this is a great idea, and is certainly a very good way to hopefully avoid or lessen player discouragement when they get a really poor dice roll. After all, it's far more discouraging when you're trying to pick a lock on a door to be told that you've simply failed it because you're not good enough, rather than to be told you failed it because as you're picking the lock, a patrol of guards comes around the corner and you're forced to duck into cover to avoid them. Chapter 11 is titled The Mindscape, and it covers the titular Mindscape in a great deal of detail. Now, the Mindscape is a vast network of virtual space that links the various star systems of the commonality. Characters with a Mindscape implant can access the virtual space to call on information they wouldn't otherwise possess, interact with the virtual world, or use it to affect the real world through techno-psi powers, as they're called in the game. Each character with a Mindscape implant has what's called a halo. We mentioned this a bit earlier in this video. The halo is a grouping of all of the skills, extras, etc. that require Mindscape connectivity to function. When connected individuals see each other, they can perceive each other's halos, although they only perceive public information like the sort of stuff you'd find in a Facebook profile, names, interests, system of birth, etc. Anything else, like skills, extras, etc., is encrypted and can be only found out via hacking or similar skills. The Mindscape, to me, feels very much like a combination of Matrix-esque technology, allowing you to gain skills and knowledge rapidly, and a pseudoscience justification for various psionic-style powers within the game. It's also possible to enter the Mindscape and interact in the virtual landscape. So, in this sense, it is like a form of net running in other sci-fi games. Now, I've never been a huge fan of net running style rules, since they tend to shift the focus of the game exclusively to the hacker / net runner style characters, leaving any less tech savvy people out in the cold. Since most commonality citizens have Mindscape implants, I expect this would be less of a problem in a Mindjammer game, but it's still something worth bearing in mind. An element I do love, though, is that the Mindscape is restricted by the speed of light, and in order to make sure that one star system's version of the Mindscape doesn't differ too much from their neighbouring systems, a huge fleet of sentient ships known as the Mindjammer fleet constantly travel the space lanes, updating it. Now this creates, in my mind, all manner of potential stories involving systems that have been isolated from the fleet and other such things like that. We move on to chapter 12, which is titled Constructs, and this chapter covers building starships, space stations, vehicles, etc., using a slightly adapted form of the Fate character generation system. I love the fact that this chapter gives you the option to play an intelligent starship as a character. And the chapter is very well written and links in neatly to the other generation and equipment chapters of the book, providing everything you need to create whatever constructs you like and run them within the setting as either extras or player characters themselves. I think this really shows off the versatility of the rules system, making just a few tweaks to adapt it to a very different scale of character generation. Chapter 13 is Starships and Space Travel. It discusses travel through space in the Mindjammer setting, in addition to the different types of space which exist in the setting. And these are N space, which is normal space as we know it, 2 space, which is an other dimensional phenomenon that allows appropriately equipped space vessels to warp normal space and travel at faster than light speeds. This is the only reason that the commonality can exist as an entity. And finally, there is 3 space, which is a recently discovered phenomenon that promises even faster travel speeds than those used by travel through 2 space. The commonality has already begun the Fargate project to build huge space gateways that take advantage of 3 space. There's a lot of information in this chapter also concerning starship manoeuvring, the methods and perils of space travel via 2 space, and a lot of sample starship stats. The starships were built using the construct rules, and it's great to see some examples from the authors. The graphics are again very nice and clear, with floor plans provided for some of the ships, which could be very useful in the game. 14 is Vehicles and Installations, and this chapter's pretty similar to the previous one, but it focuses on vehicles and buildings of various kinds, again using a slightly tweaked character generation system. Chapter 15 is titled Organisations, and it's a very interesting chapter that again slightly tweaks the skill list in order to provide a very workable and not too complex system for designing and generating organisations and having abstract conflicts resolved between them. One thing I particularly like is that the rules in this chapter can be adapted to service fleet or mass conflicts by having units, divisions, etc. statted up as various sizes of organisation that are engaging each other. I think this is a great way of resolving such large conflicts without them just becoming mass dice rolling exercises. The scale rules also support the player characters getting directly involved in such conflicts without them being lost in the background. which can only be a good thing, to be honest, since the PCs in Fate are supposed to be extremely competent and the centre of the story. Chapter 16 is titled The New Commonality Era, and it describes the history of the default setting, a dynamic explorative civilization that eventually fell into stagnation and introspection, losing contact with and abandoning most of its far-lying colonies. With the discovery of planing, the technology that allows travel through two-space, a lot of these colonies were rediscovered, and a wave of new blood, excitement and hope swept through the commonality. However, all was not perfect, and the commonality has had its fair share of conflicts, from the Venu, a society of xenophobic, purist humans, to the various xenomorphs that have been encountered. A lot of this chapter is filled with organisation stats for the various empires, political agencies, etc., which are fairly useful as far as they go, and they leave a lot of scope in the setting for the individual GM to adjust it according to their preferences or the needs of their games. Chapter 17 is entitled Cultures, and is similar to the Organisations chapter, but based around designing different cultures, again using an adapted character generation system. Chapters 18 and 19 are titled Worlds and Civilizations for Chapter 18 and Stellar Bodies and Star Systems for Chapter 19. And these two chapters basically offer a series of tables and advice on creating individual worlds, planets and whole star systems. The advice given is very useful, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can sort of dip in and use in your game, even if you choose not to use the generation tables themselves. That said, the tables would be extremely useful if you were creating a travelling space epic where new locations were needed regularly, or if you just needed a system on the fly. I like the fact there are different tables depending on what level of detail and complexity you want to go into. Chapter 20 is titled Commonality Space, and it gives a brief rundown on the current status of the commonality and the various regions that compose it, from the core worlds centred on Old Earth to the fringe and outer worlds. There's a more detailed breakdown of Manhome, as it's called in the system, which is the Sol star system, and it's quite interesting to see the additions that the authors have made given the time that's elapsed from present day to the start of the game. Chapter 21 is called Alien Life, and again it's a series of tables and options, but this time for creating forms of alien life and the biospheres and ecosystems that support them. Again, it's very well thought out and offers differing levels of detail depending on what you want. Again, as with the previous chapter, I can see these being very useful if an alien life form, an alien biosphere is needed on the fly, or there's a lot of travelling involved in your campaign. Chapter 22 is called Scenarios and Campaigns, and it offers the budding Mindjammer GM advice on creating scenarios, from the initial hook that draws the PCs into the game to the opposition that stands in their way and the locations where the scenario or the campaign take place. The advice offered in this chapter is very solid and provides some good tips around structuring your game, offering various different models that could potentially be used to build a campaign, from the traditional 3-act structure to the picaresque structure that focuses on a succession of travel episodes related to a specific theme, linking them all together. One intriguing idea is that of plot stress, which is basically adapting the stress track mechanic from the Fate system to keep track of the progress of a plot as the game moves forward. Chapter 23 is titled Themes, Genres and Styles of Play, and it talks about the main themes of a Mindjammer game, which are transhumanism, the evolution of the human down strange and wondrous paths, the Golden Age, or A New Hope. After all, with the discovery of two-space, a new optimism and a sense of discovery has swept through the commonality, and once again they're reaching outwards, trying to reconnect with their lost colonies. However, this brings us on to the third theme, which is conflict, both physical and cultural, since as the commonality does push outwards, making contact with long lost colonies and strange worlds, there's often cultural conflict. After all, these far-flung colonies have been isolated for some time, their culture has developed significantly differently from the commonality. And whenever two cultures come together that are very different, there's always this initial clash. Sometimes this escalates to the physical conflict, or sometimes we head straight to the physical conflict between the commonality and those who do not belong within their sphere, so to speak. And there's a discussion of various styles of play, tones and different genres that you can replicate using the Mindjammer game. Basically, if you can think of a sci-fi genre or a sci-fi setting or sci-fi tropes, you can pretty much represent it with the Mindjammer game. Chapter 24 is called the Daradine Rim, which is a sample system built using the rules from earlier in the book. It's very solid and very interesting to read, and could easily serve as a pick up and run campaign setting with a little bit more detail. Or failing that, it serves as an excellent example of what you can do using the rules that have already been presented in the book. Now, after chapter 24, there are the appendices, which are a useful collection of sheets for creating characters, constructs, organisations, cultures, planets, systems and sectors. Basically, for everything that has been listed earlier on in the game, there is a sheet here for you to write down the details of your new creation on, which is a nice thing to see in the book and would be very handy. There's also a handy rules reference sheet, which I think would be very useful during play. So, in conclusion, when it comes to sci-fi for the Fate system, Mindjammer pretty much contains everything you could possibly want to run almost any type of sci-fi game using Fate, whether it's military sci-fi, space opera, whatever you want, you can probably find at least something of use in here. The default setting of the book, the commonality, is broad enough that it allows scope for customization and tweaking to fit your particular subgenre of science fiction, and yet it has enough sparks of individuality and uniqueness with the Mindjammer fleet, the Fargates, etc., none of which are entirely original, but they're given enough of a polish and a tweak in this setting that it draws in the reader and it can spark some ideas off in the budding GM's mind. Many of the chapters are very similar in this book, in effect providing slightly alternate methods of using the Fate character generation system to make everything from player characters right the way through the scale up to vast spaceships and stellar systems. Now, I don't think that's a weakness in the book, far from it. I think the main strength of the book, as far as I'm concerned, it's not as a single campaign setting, although there is nothing wrong with the commonality as a setting, it's very compelling. But I think it works best as a sort of recipe book that you can dip into when you want and take out whatever elements would be most suitable for your game. And you can quite easily put aside any bits that don't work for you. It's got a very modular sort of design, which I think's very, very useful indeed. So basically what I'm saying is, if you're looking for an all-in-one big book, and I mean big book, look at it, of science fiction using the Fate system, then I highly recommend Mindjammer. There's an awful lot of mileage you can get from this book, whether you run science fiction or not. Many of the rules, such as organisations, scales, etc., could easily be adapted and will offer a lot of use in non-science fiction games. Now, at £15.73 in British pounds, I believe that's about $27, Mindjammer is not the cheapest Fate game around. However, for how lovely the book is and for the sheer size and amount of useful material that you get in it, it's more than worth the price, in my opinion. If you're looking for anything relating to sci-fi and fate, you will find something of use in this book. I highly recommend you give it a look. If you find the price a bit daunting, it's also available on PDF. As I say, if you're planning to run something science fiction in fate, I highly recommend you give it a book, and I've very much enjoyed reading it. So I hope if you've enjoyed this RPG review, you'll click on like and subscribe. If you have any comments regarding anything, please leave them in the box below or hit me up in the Google Plus links. And until I see you next time, take care and thank you very much for watching. See you soon.